Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking all about machine learning.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's one of those buzzwords everyone's always using these days, but
Mhm.
what does it actually mean? And why should you care?
Yeah, that's a great question, and luckily you've shared some really interesting articles and research with me, so we can dive deep into this
Awesome.
together.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the first thing to understand is that machine learning is basically a way for computers to learn from data without someone having to program them with specific instructions for every single situation.
Right.
It's like teaching a kid to ride a bike. You don't give them a step-by-step manual, right?
Yeah.
Show them how it's done, let them try, and they figure it out through trial and error.
Exactly. And just like a kid learning to ride a bike, the more the computer practices, the better it gets.
Right.
The more data it's fed, the better it gets at recognizing patterns and making predictions.
Yeah. Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. Because the quality of that learning and the decisions the computer makes depend heavily on the data itself, the algorithms used, and how people interact with the system.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about the whole ecosystem around it.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now imagine you're scrolling through your social media feed. Have you ever noticed how the content you see seems to reinforce your existing beliefs?
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that.
Well, that's an example of how machine learning can create echo chambers. The algorithms are designed to show you content you're likely to engage with. But that can lead to a situation where you're only exposed to one side of the story.
Right.
So even though no one is intentionally programming these systems to be biased, the way they're designed and the data they're trained on can have unintended consequences.
Right.
That's a little unsettling, to be honest.
I get it. It's something we all need to be aware of.
And that's why we're doing this deep dive. So let's dig into some specific examples from the sources you sent me.
Okay, sounds good.
I was reading this article about a system called complexities, which is used by some courts to predict the likelihood of someone committing another crime. Turns out it was flagging black defendants at higher risk even when their criminal histories were similar to white defendants. How does that even happen if no one is intentionally programming it to be racist?
That's a prime example of how historical bias can creep into machine learning systems. Compass, like many algorithms, relies on data from the past. And if that data reflects existing societal biases, like the fact that black communities are disproportionately policed and incarcerated, the algorithm will learn and perpetuate those biases.
Wow.
It's like teaching a kid to ride a bike on a road full of potholes. They might learn to ride, but they'll also pick up some bad habits along the way.
So even if the algorithm itself is neutral, the data it's trained on can make it biased.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. Sometimes the way we measure or collect data introduces bias right from the start. Let's say you're building a system to recommend job candidates. If the historical data shows that men are more likely to be hired for leadership positions, the algorithm might unintentionally favor male candidates even if they're not necessarily more qualified.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's like training that bike riding kid on a road that's tilted in one direction. They'll naturally end up leaning that way.
So we've got to be really careful about what data we feed these systems and how we measure it.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the different types of bias that can affect machine learning. I was reading about things like measurement bias, omitted variable bias, even popularity bias. It's a whole buffet of biases.
It can definitely feel overwhelming, but let's break it down. We've already touched on measurement bias. That's when the way we measure something is flawed or biased from the beginning. Like in that job candidate example, if the data only reflects who was hired in the past and not who was actually the most qualified, then it's already biased.
Right.
Right. Then there's omitted variable bias, which is when we leave out important information that would change the whole picture. Imagine you're building a system to predict student success in college. If you only consider their grades and test scores, but not their socioeconomic background or access to resources, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. It's like trying to predict the outcome of a race based solely on the runner's speed without considering things like wind conditions or the terrain. So the algorithm might make inaccurate predictions because it's missing crucial context.
Exactly.
And that can lead to unfair outcomes, like students from disadvantaged backgrounds being denied opportunities even though they have the potential to succeed.
Okay, what about this popularity bias thing? That sounds kind of sneaky.
Popularity bias is a tricky one. It's when systems favor what's already popular, even if that popularity is due to manipulation or other unfair factors. Think about online reviews. Do they always reflect the true quality of a product or service, or are they sometimes influenced by fake reviews, paid promotions, or even just the herd mentality of following the crowd?
I've definitely been swayed by reviews before, even if I had a hunch they might not be entirely genuine.
Right. And that's how popularity bias can skew our perceptions and decisions. It can create a self-reinforcing cycle where the most popular things get even more popular, even if they don't deserve to be. It's
Yeah.
like a popularity contest where some contestants are stuffing the ballot docs.
Exactly. So we've got to be critical thinkers and not just blindly trust what the algorithm is showing us. Now, let's talk about a real head-scratcher Simpson's paradox. This is where a trend appears in the data overall, but disappears or even reverses when you break that data down into smaller groups.
Okay, that sounds a bit mind-bendy.
I know, right? But it's important to understand because it shows how easily we can be misled by statistics. Here's a classic example. Back in the 70s, there was a gender bias lawsuit against UC Berkeley. When they looked at the overall admissions data, it seemed like women were being admitted to graduate programs at a lower rate than men. However, when they analyzed the data by department, it turned out that women were often admitted at equal or even slightly higher rates than men within each department.
Wait, so the overall trend was misleading because it didn't account for the differences between departments.
Exactly. It turned out that women were more likely to apply to departments with lower admission rates for both genders. So it wasn't that the university was intentionally discriminating against women, it was that the data was hiding a more complex story. That's a great illustration of why we need to be careful about drawing conclusions from aggregated data. We need to dig deeper and look at the nuances. Now, imagine that same logic applied to something like loan approvals. If a bank is using an algorithm to decide who gets approved for a loan, and that algorithm is trained on historical data that reflects existing socioeconomic disparities,
Mm.
it's possible that the algorithm could unintentionally discriminate against certain groups, even if it's not explicitly programmed to do so.
Right.
That's why it's so important to understand these different types of bias. They can have real-world consequences, and we need to be vigilant in identifying and mitigating them.
Okay, so we've covered data bias, but you also mentioned that the algorithms themselves can be biased. Can you explain how that happens?
Of course, algorithmic bias stems from the choices made when designing and building the algorithm. It's like baking a cake. Even if you use the same ingredients, the way you combine them and the temperature you bake at will affect the final outcome.
So even if the data is unbiased, the algorithm itself can introduce bias. Exactly. For example, the specific mathematical formulas used, the type of machine learning model chosen, and even the optimization techniques employed can all introduce bias. It's like having a recipe that calls for a certain amount of flour. If you accidentally add too much or too little, it's going to affect the texture of the cake.
Makes sense.
So even small tweaks to the algorithm can have a big impact on the results.
Absolutely. And the scary part is that algorithms can actually amplify existing biases in the data.
Hmm.
Imagine an algorithm designed to personalize news recommendations. If it's trained on data showing that people tend to click on articles that confirm their existing beliefs, the algorithm might end up reinforcing those biases by only showing users content that aligns with their preconceptions.
Right.
It's like being stuck in an echo chamber, only hearing voices that agree with you.
Exactly. And that can make it even harder to engage with different perspectives and challenge our own biases. So it's not just about making sure the data is unbiased. We also need to be mindful of how the algorithms themselves are designed and how they might perpetuate or even amplify existing biases.
Right. And speaking of perpetuating bias, let's talk about feedback loops. This is where our own interactions with these systems can actually contribute to the problem. Wait, so we can make the bias worse.
Unfortunately, yes. The choices we make as users can influence the data collected by these systems, which then gets used to further train and refine the algorithms. It's like a vicious cycle.
Give us an example of how that might play out.
Okay, think about online job platforms. If an algorithm is trained on data showing that men are historically more likely to be hired for certain roles, it might inadvertently rank male candidates higher in search results. This could lead to a scenario where women are less likely to be seen by recruiters, further reinforcing the bias in the data and making it even harder for women to break into those fields.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The algorithm's initial bias influences user behavior in a way that ends up confirming that bias.
Exactly. And this is why it's crucial to be aware of these feedback loops and design systems that break those cycles rather than perpetuating them. We need to be mindful of how our own actions can impact these systems and work towards creating a more equitable and inclusive digital world.
Now that we have a better understanding of how bias can sneak into machine learning, what are some ways to combat this problem? Can we even trust machine learning at all if it's so susceptible to bias?
That's a valid concern, and thankfully, there's a whole field of research dedicated to developing fairer machine learning. Researchers are coming up with all sorts of clever methods to mitigate bias, both in the data and the algorithms themselves.
Okay, break it down for me. What are some of the key approaches to making machine learning more equitable?
Think of it like this. We can intervene at different stages before, during, or even after the algorithm is trained. We have a toolbox full of different techniques, and it's about choosing the right tool for the job and using it skillfully.
So we can address bias at multiple points in the process.
Exactly. We can pre-process the data to remove bias before training even begins.
Makes sense.
It's like cleaning up the ingredients before you start cooking.
What about during the training process?
We can build fairness constraints directly into the algorithms themselves. This could involve adjusting the mathematical formulas or adding penalties for biased outcomes. It's like tweaking the recipe as you go along to make sure the dish comes out balanced and flavorful.
And what about after the algorithm is trained?
We can adjust the outputs after the algorithm has made its predictions. This is like adding a final garnish to the dish to make it even more appealing.
So we have options at every stage. It's not a hopeless situation.
Not at all. There's a lot of promising work being done in this area, but it requires a multifaceted approach, addressing bias in the data, the algorithms, and even our own interactions with these systems.
It sounds like creating fair AI is an ongoing process, not a one-time fix.
Absolutely. It's an iterative process that requires constant vigilance, collaboration, and a willingness to learn and adapt.
This is fascinating stuff, but I'm curious to hear more about how these fairness definitions are actually applied in practice. We've talked about equality of opportunity and demographic parity, but what do those look like in real-world systems?
It's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how we translate these abstract concepts into tangible outcomes. Let's take the example of hiring algorithms, which are increasingly used to screen job applicants. If we want to ensure equality of opportunity, we need to make sure that the algorithm doesn't unfairly disadvantage qualified candidates based on protected characteristics like race, gender, or age.
So in this case, equality of opportunity would mean that candidates from different demographic groups have an equal chance of being selected for an interview, assuming they meet the basic qualifications for the job.
Precisely. The algorithm should focus on the skills and experience relevant to the role and avoid being swayed by irrelevant factors.
Okay.
Now, if we want to achieve demographic parity, that means ensuring that the proportion of candidates selected from different demographic groups reflects their representation in the applicant pool.
So if, say, 30% of the applicants are women, then roughly 30% of the candidates selected for interviews should also be women.
You got it. This can help address historical imbalances and promote a more diverse workforce.
It sounds like achieving these fairness goals requires a deep understanding of both the technical aspects of machine learning and the social context in which these systems are being used.
Absolutely. It's not just about writing code. It's about understanding the potential impact of that code on people's lives and making deliberate choices to mitigate harm and promote fairness.
This all makes me think back to that compass system we discussed earlier. Knowing what we know now about bias in machine learning, how might we approach designing a fairer system for predicting recidivism?
That's a crucial question, and there's no easy answer. But here are some key considerations. First, we need to carefully scrutinize the data used to train the algorithm. Is it truly representative of the population it's being applied to? Does it reflect historical biases that we need to address?
So like going back to the drawing board and making sure we're not perpetuating past injustices in the data itself.
Exactly. We might need to collect new data, reweight existing data, or even develop new ways to measure risk that don't rely on factors that are inherently biased. It's like building a new foundation for the system, one that's based on fairness and equity from the ground up.
Precisely.
Then we need to carefully select the algorithm and fine-tune its parameters to minimize bias. We might experiment with different types of models, different fairness constraints, and different optimization techniques to find the best balance between accuracy and fairness.
So it's about finding the right recipe and adjusting it to create a system that's both effective and ethical.
Exactly. We also need to be transparent about the limitations of the system and avoid overselling its capabilities. No algorithm is perfect, and we need to acknowledge the potential for error and bias even after taking all these precautions. It's about being humble and recognizing that we're dealing with complex systems that can have unintended consequences.
Precisely.
We need to build in mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and evaluation, ensuring that the system is performing as intended and making adjustments as needed.
It's like a continuous improvement process,
Yeah.
always striving to make the system fairer and more effective.
Exactly. And crucially, we need to involve stakeholders from diverse communities in the design and development process.
So this is about bringing in different voices and perspectives to ensure that the system reflects the needs and concerns of the people it's intended to serve.
You got it. It's about collaboration, transparency, and a deep commitment to creating a more just and equitable world through the responsible use of technology.
It's inspiring to see how much work is being done to ensure fairness in machine learning,
Yeah.
but it's also clear that this is an ongoing journey, one that
Yeah.
requires our continued attention and engagement.
Absolutely. The future of AI depends on our collective wisdom and responsibility.
It's fascinating how much focus there is on making this technology fair. It really speaks to the potential impact it has on our lives.
Mhm.
It's not just about like making cool gadgets or whatever. It's
Mhm.
about shaping the future of society.
Yeah.
And with that comes a responsibility to make sure that future is just and equitable for everyone.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting?
What's that?
There's a whole area of research dedicated to the legal and regulatory side of all this. Like, how do we make sure our laws are keeping up with the rapid pace of AI development?
Oh, wow. I hadn't even thought about that angle.
Well, think about it this way. We have laws in place to prevent discrimination in areas like housing, employment, and lending, right?
Of course.
But how do those laws apply when decisions are being made by algorithms instead of humans?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a whole new legal frontier, and
Mhm.
experts are trying to figure out how to adapt existing laws and create new ones to ensure fairness in the age of AI.
So it's like we're trying to build guardrails for this technology, making sure it doesn't veer off course and cause harm.
Exactly. And it's not just about preventing harm, it's also about promoting positive social outcomes.
Yeah.
I was reading about how AI could be used to identify and address systemic biases in areas like healthcare, education, and criminal justice.
So it's not all doom and gloom. AI can actually be a force for good.
Absolutely. It has the potential to make our systems fairer and more equitable, but only if we're intentional about it. Now, let's not forget about us, the users. We have a role to play in all of this too, right?
We do. As users, we need to be aware of the potential for bias in the systems we interact with. We should ask questions about how algorithms are being used, what data they're trained on, and what steps are being taken to ensure fairness.
Right.
So it's like being an informed consumer, but instead of just looking at ingredients labels, we're asking about the ethical sourcing and production practices of the AI we're consuming.
I love that analogy. We also have a responsibility to hold these systems accountable. If we encounter bias or unfair outcomes, we should speak up, report it, and demand better.
Yeah.
It's like we're all part of a quality control team, helping to identify and flag any defects in the system so they can be fixed.
Exactly. The more we engage in these conversations and demand better, the faster we can move towards a future where AI benefits everyone. Now, one area where these fairness considerations become especially critical is in the development of autonomous systems.
Right.
Things like self-driving cars and robots that are making decisions with potentially life-altering consequences.
Yeah.
How are researchers approaching the challenge of building fairness into these systems?
It's a complex and evolving area of research. One approach is to develop ethical frameworks that guide the decision-making process of these systems. For example, researchers are exploring how to incorporate principles like beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy into the algorithms that govern these systems.
So it's like giving these systems a moral compass to help them navigate complex situations where there might not be a clear right or wrong answer.
Precisely. And it's not just about programming in a set of rules, but also about enabling these systems to learn and adapt to new situations, much like humans do. This involves training them on vast data sets of real-world scenarios and providing them with mechanisms to evaluate the ethical implications of their actions.
It's like giving them a crash course in moral philosophy, but instead of reading books, they're learning from experience.
Exactly. And just like humans, these systems will inevitably make mistakes. But the goal is to create systems that learn from those mistakes, improve over time, and ultimately make decisions that align with our shared values.
Now, we've talked a lot about the technical and ethical challenges of building fair AI, but I'm also curious about the economic implications. I mean, if we're going to prioritize fairness, does that necessarily mean sacrificing efficiency or profitability?
It's a common concern, and it's important to address it head on. While there might be some short-term costs associated with developing fair AI, research suggests that in the long run, fairness and profitability are not mutually exclusive.
Okay, unpack that for us. How can fairness actually be good for business?
For one thing, fairer systems are often more robust and reliable. When algorithms are trained on biased data, they're more likely to make inaccurate or even harmful predictions, leading to costly errors and reputational damage. By contrast, fairer systems are better at generalizing to new situations and making decisions that are accurate and trustworthy, leading to increased efficiency and customer satisfaction.
Makes sense.
It's like investing in quality control. It might cost a bit more upfront, but it can save you a lot of headaches and expense in the long run.
Exactly.
Fairer systems can also tap into new markets and opportunities. When companies prioritize inclusivity and accessibility, they can reach a wider range of customers and build stronger relationships based on trust and respect.
It's like expanding your customer base and creating a more loyal following by showing that you value diversity and fairness.
Precisely. And let's not forget about the social good. When companies use AI to promote equity and opportunity, they're not just improving their bottom line, they're also making a positive contribution to society.
Yeah.
It's like a win-win situation, doing well by doing good.
Exactly. So while there might be some upfront costs associated with developing fair AI, the long-term benefits far outweigh the risks.
Right.
It sounds like fairness is not just a nice to have, it's a must have for any organization that wants to thrive in the age of AI.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the world of machine learning and fairness, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the emerging trends and challenges on the horizon.
Okay.
What are some of the things that keep you up at night? And what are you most excited about in terms of the future of fair AI?
It's a fascinating time to be working in this field with new advancements happening every day. One area that I'm particularly excited about is the development of explainable AI or XAI.
Explainable AI. Tell us
Yeah.
more about that.
Traditional machine learning models are often seen as like black boxes. They make predictions, but it's not always clear how they arrive at those predictions.
Right.
XAI aims to make these models more transparent and understandable, allowing us to see the reasoning behind their decisions.
So it's like lifting the veil and peering into the inner workings of these algorithms to see what's driving their choices.
Exactly. This is crucial for building trust in AI systems, especially in high-stakes domains like healthcare and finance. If we can understand how an algorithm is making decisions, we can better assess its fairness, identify potential biases, and make adjustments as needed.
Yeah.
It's like having a user manual for the algorithm, allowing us to troubleshoot any problems and ensure it's operating as intended.
Great analogy.
And it goes beyond just understanding how individual algorithms work. XAI can also help us understand the broader social impacts of these technologies.
Yeah.
For example, if we can see how an algorithm is being used to allocate resources or make decisions about access to opportunities, we can better assess whether those decisions are fair and equitable.
It's like having an audit trail for the algorithm, allowing us to track its impact and hold it accountable for its actions.
Precisely. Now, while XAI is a promising area of research, there are also challenges. One is the trade-off between explainability and accuracy. Sometimes the most accurate models are also the most complex and difficult to explain.
So it's like a balancing act, finding the sweet spot between complexity and transparency.
Exactly. And the right balance will depend on the specific application. In some cases, we might prioritize accuracy even if it means sacrificing some explainability. In other cases, explainability might be paramount, even if it means accepting a slight decrease in accuracy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's about making informed choices, weighing the potential benefits and risks of different approaches.
Precisely.
Another challenge is ensuring that explanations are actually understandable to humans. I mean, it's no use having an explainable AI system if the explanations are so technical and jargon-filled that only a handful of experts can understand them.
It's like having a user manual written in a foreign language. Not very helpful.
Exactly. So there's a growing focus on developing explanations that are clear, concise, and tailored to the specific audience. It's like designing user interfaces for AI, making them more intuitive and accessible to everyone.
Precisely. Now, beyond XAI, There are a number of other emerging trends that I find both exciting and concerning. One is the increasing use of AI in surveillance technologies.
Mm.
Oh, that's definitely a topic that raises a lot of ethical questions. What are some of the specific concerns around AI-powered surveillance?
Well, for one thing, it raises serious concerns about privacy and civil liberties. Facial recognition technology, for example, can be used to track individuals' movements and activities without their knowledge or consent.
It's like Big Brother on steroids.
That's a powerful image. And this technology can be used in ways that are discriminatory and unjust. For example, studies have shown that facial recognition systems are less accurate at identifying people with darker skin tones, which can lead to misidentification and wrongful arrests.
That's really concerning. It sounds like we need strong regulations and oversight to ensure that these technologies are being used responsibly and ethically.
Absolutely. We need to have a public conversation about the acceptable limits of surveillance and ensure that these technologies are not being used to erode our fundamental rights.
It's a crucial conversation to have, especially as these technologies become more sophisticated and pervasive.
Precisely. Another emerging trend that's both exciting and challenging is the development of autonomous weapons systems.
Oh, wow. That sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie.
It's a reality that's rapidly approaching. These systems are essentially robots that can select and engage targets without human intervention.
That's terrifying. I mean, what happens if these systems make mistakes or fall into the wrong hands?
Those are exactly the concerns that ethicists and researchers are grappling with. There's a growing movement to ban the development and deployment of these weapons, arguing that they pose an unacceptable risk to humanity. It's like opening Pandora's box. Once these weapons are out there, it might be impossible to control them.
That's a sobering thought. And it highlights the urgent need for international agreements and regulations to govern the development and use of AI in military applications. It's a reminder that as powerful as AI is, we can't simply hand over control to machines without carefully considering the ethical and societal implications.
Precisely. Now, despite these concerns, I remain optimistic about the future of AI. I believe that with careful planning, ethical design, and strong regulations, we can harness the power of AI to create a more just, equitable, and prosperous world for everyone.
I share your optimism, but it's clear that we have a lot of work to do to get there.
Yep.
It's been an eye-opening conversation. We've explored the complex world of machine learning and fairness, delving into the different types of bias, the techniques being developed to mitigate those biases, and the broader societal implications of this rapidly evolving field. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd like to turn it over to you, our listeners. What are some of the things you've learned from today's episode? What are your hopes and concerns about the future of AI? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We're all in this together, and we need to keep these conversations going. It's amazing how much there is to think about when it comes to AI, you know?
I know, right? It's not just about the technology itself, it's about the people who build it, the people who use it,
Right.
and the impact it has on society as a whole. We've talked a lot about the importance of fairness, but how do we actually make sure AI is developed and used in a way that benefits everyone?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer, but I think a good starting point is transparency and accountability.
Right.
Those are big words. What do they mean in the context of AI?
Well, transparency means being open about how AI systems work, what data they're trained on, and what steps are being taken to ensure fairness.
So it's like asking for a behind-the-scenes tour of the algorithm, seeing how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Exactly. We need to be able to scrutinize these systems, identify potential biases, and hold them accountable for their decisions. It's like having a public inspection process for AI, making sure it meets certain safety and ethical standards before it's released into the wild.
Great analogy. And it's not just about scrutinizing individual systems, it's also about demanding broader systemic changes.
Right.
Systemic changes, like what?
Well, for one thing, we need to address the lack of diversity in the tech industry itself.
That's a crucial point. If the people designing and building these systems don't reflect the diversity of the population, then it's more likely that their biases will be baked into the technology.
Precisely. We need more women, people of color, and people from underrepresented communities in the field of AI. It's about bringing in different voices, perspectives, and lived experiences to ensure that these systems are designed with fairness and inclusivity in mind.
Exactly. And it's not just about who's building the systems, it's also about who's benefiting from them.
Right.
So it's about ensuring that the benefits of AI are distributed equitably across society and not just concentrated in the hands of a privileged few.
Precisely. We need to be mindful of the potential for AI to exacerbate existing inequalities and take steps to mitigate those risks. It's like using AI as a tool for social good, a force for positive change, rather than just another engine of inequality.
I love that framing. Now, another key aspect of accountability is having mechanisms for redress.
Right.
Redress, what do you mean by that?
It means having ways for individuals to challenge decisions made by AI systems to appeal those decisions if they believe they've been treated unfairly.
So it's like having a court of appeals for algorithms, a way to ensure that there's due process even when decisions are being made by machines.
Exactly. This could involve creating independent oversight bodies, establishing ethical review boards, or even developing new legal frameworks to govern the use of AI. It's about ensuring that there are checks and balances in place, that we don't just blindly trust these systems without having ways to challenge their authority.
Precisely. Now, transparency, accountability, diversity. These are all crucial elements of building a fairer and more ethical AI ecosystem. It sounds like a monumental task.
Mhm.
Are you hopeful that we can achieve these goals?
I am. I believe that we're at a critical juncture in the development of AI.
A juncture. How so?
We have a choice to make. We can continue down the path of unfettered technological advancement, prioritizing efficiency and profit above all else, or we can choose a different path, one that prioritizes human values, fairness, and social justice. It's like we're at a fork in the road, and the decisions we make now will have profound implications for the future of humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I believe that the growing awareness of the potential risks and harms of AI is a sign that we're starting to head in the right direction.
Right.
There's definitely more attention being paid to these issues now than ever before.
There is. And that's thanks, in large part, to the work of activists, researchers, journalists, and everyday citizens who are raising their voices and demanding better.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of AI, that we can't just leave it to the experts or the corporations to decide what's best for us.
Absolutely. The future of AI is too important to be left to a select few. It's something we need to decide together as a society.
Well said. It's been an inspiring and thought-provoking conversation, and we hope it sparked some important questions and discussions among you, our listeners. We encourage you to continue exploring the world of machine learning and fairness, to stay informed, engaged, and to be active participants in shaping the future of AI. Remember, folks, the future is not predetermined. It's something we create together, one algorithm, one decision, one conversation at a time. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and ever-evolving world of machine learning and fairness. Until next time.